Hello, and welcome to Let's Talk Climate, a weekly webcast series from ecoAmerica. Featuring dynamic discussions with local and national leaders offering diverse perspectives, Let's Talk Climate brings forth the latest thinking and best practices for building public support and political resolve for equitable climate solutions in the U.S. I'm Rebecca Rehr, Director of the Climate for Health program at ecoAmerica. I am humbled to be here today to record a conversation about environmental racism, climate justice, and health with Vernice Miller-Travis, Executive Vice President at the Metropolitan Group and one of the nation's leading experts, pioneers, and most respected thought leaders on environmental justice. Hi, Vernice.
Hi, Rebecca. Good morning. How are you?
Hanging in there, Vernice. and we'll get to how you're doing in just a minute. Thank you so much for being here today. And as we are wont to do here on Let's Talk Climate, let's jump in. My first question, thanks. My first question to you is, it's going to be in two parts. Part A. So the other night I tuned into a town hall that was hosted by our partners at the American Psychological Association. And it was they were calling it the racism pandemic. And, you know, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and so many more that preceded them, Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Philando Castile, Freddie Gray. Their CEO, Dr. Arthur Evans, opened the town hall by asking the question, is this Groundhog Day or is this a tipping point? And I wanted to get your reflections on that question in a real broad sense. Do you feel like we have been here before? And if so, what's it going to take to see real change?
I don't think we've actually been in this moment before. And by that, I mean that the demand to support the umbrella call of Black Lives Matter and all that means is being lifted up and supported by so many people in so many places around the world, around our country, in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, not sure about the Marshall Islands. People are coming out in support of this call to action in a way that I've never seen before in my lifetime. And, you know, I lived through the civil rights movement. Granted, I was a little kid, I was in elementary school, but my father was active in it. And there was some support, there was huge white support, right, that lifted up the civil rights movement. But everybody came to the South and did work there. And now the unfinished business of the civil rights movement is that people did not come back from the battlefront in the Deep South and do that battling in Boston and in New York City and in Milwaukee and in Minneapolis and in Chicago and in Detroit and all over New York, especially the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut metropolitan area. Some of the most segregated cities and geospatial spaces in the United States are in the New York City metropolitan area. Everywhere, right? Everywhere. We went back to an existence where we lived segregated lives in segregated communities with very little interaction with each other. And the disinvestment that happened in communities of color just kept going on and on and on. And people have had it. You know, but people have especially had it around the devaluing of Black lives. But I've never seen so many people step up in this way. And so, you know, you and I are in the DMV. Both you and I, you live in DC. DC is the center of my work life, although I live in Prince George's County, Maryland. You know, we used to refer to DC as Chocolate City. That's a whole nother show for why it's not Chocolate City anymore, but it's still Cafe Olay. Thank you very much. But when you look at the activity on the streets of DC, you see 10 young white people for every young Black person you see out there. Yeah. And I'm not saying that that's what I need to make me happy, but it sure is different, right? And it's sustained. I mean, what, is this the 17th day that people will be out there? And they're out there and, you know, I can't speak for other parts of the country, but it's been hot as hell here. right? We are in full on summer, which is really humid and really hot. And that's what it's been here. And people still keep coming out day after day, night after night. I've never seen anything like it. I've never seen anything like it.
And in the torrential rain the other night, there
and
were.
the torrential rain. And how about they were attacked by the U.S. military, right? And federal police and federal forces and the National Guard. And they were tear gassed. To hell with you, Barr. They were tear gassed and they were pepper bombed, right? And they were beaten. That was Monday night, a week ago Monday. And they came back stronger on Tuesday. And they've been coming back stronger every day after that. So, you know, you look at these folks in Portland. You look at the folks in Los Angeles. You look at the folks in Seattle. They are throwing down. I mean, really, really, really throwing down. There was a picture from Seattle, the demonstrations in Seattle 2 nights ago, when the street is like covered in a fog that looks like a thick, heavy San Francisco fog. It's tear gas. And they still stayed out there, right? Yeah. So I don't think this is deja vu. I don't think this is Groundhog Day. I think something critical has shifted. And I think part of it is the brutality of the modern day lynching that is still happening to Black men and to Black people. You know, Breonna Taylor was asleep in her bed, asleep. She was murdered in her sleep. She's an EMT worker. Oh my God. So I think the narrative that Black people have been telling for a really long time is it's just so in your face and so all encompassing. It's hard to turn away, and you have to have a heart of steel to turn away from this, right?
And it almost feels like the lack of inaction, because now too, people are coming with a very specific ask, and the lack of movement on that ask is actually, rather than discouraging or disheartening people or certainly disappointing people, but it's not, but it is firing people up. And I want to ask you, part 2 of my question is the same question, but very specifically about the environmental movement. And I don't know that a lot of people know about the origins. You know, we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, the origins of the environmental movement in 1970, right? You know, on the tails of the civil rights movement, when leaders of the environmental movement had an opportunity to address environmental injustices at that time, they were relegated to the category, civil rights was relegated to the category of social issues and not environmental issues. And I want your advice on how to not make that mistake again.
So let me correct one thing. The environmental movement did not begin in 1970, right? So the conservation movement, the land and conservation movement, is well over 100 years old. The Sierra Club is over 100 years old. The National Wildlife Federation is over 100 years old. And that part of the environmental movement is particularly troubling because it came from, there was a lot of connectivity between the eugenics movement and the founding of the conservation movement. In fact, some of those people are the same people, leaders of the eugenics movement and leaders of the conservation movement. And part of it was an attempt to get away from those people. And those people were, were freed people of color, Black people, indigenous people. Some of that conservation movement, the establishment of the national parks, is about taking land from indigenous people that they owned, that they had treaties, that they had lived on for millennia, right? And taking that land so that we could establish the national park system so that white folks could come and see wilderness, right? So almost everything about the conservation movement is based on some really racist stuff. So that's the conservation movement, which is an antecedent to the environmental movement that we know of that came forth on Earth Day in 1970. One of the things I find really, really odd, and I found this out from doing some research in the archives of the Ford Foundation when I worked at the Ford Foundation. So when I worked at the Ford Foundation from 2000 to 2003, I led the creation of the first and only environmental justice grant making portfolio at the Ford Foundation in the US, although I did a lot of international grant making as well. And I wanted to look in the archives to see, you know, what had we done? Because the Ford Foundation had done a tremendous amount of grant making. In fact, they were a critical partner to the modern environmental movement in getting them launched and funding them and helping to establish a number of organizations. And what I found in looking in the archives was that it was recommended to these various folks who were coming to talk to Ford about establishing these new organizations, that the foundation, the Ford Foundation, recommended to these folks that they use the model of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund as the organizational model. So, because it was a very successful model, it had wrought major systemic change in the United States around issues of race, racial exclusion, et cetera, segregation, blah, blah, blah. But the model was a legal advocacy organization that also does research, writing, social science research, demographic research, geospatial research, social science, you know, psychological research. Brown versus Board of Education was based on a very serious experiment that was done to look at how young Black children perceive themselves. It was called the white doll, black doll exercise, right? And that was an exercise that was paid for and became a fundamental part of the legal case that the NAACP Legal Defense Fund made to attack segregated education in the United States. It obviously has, from then until now, has rendered a tremendous sea change in the United States. So they said, this is the model that you should look at. From an organizational structural standpoint, we think this might really work for you too. And they said, you're right, that's great. We'll take that. But we ain't going with none of that equity, racial justice, equality stuff. That's not what we're here for. We're not here for that, right? We're here for protection of natural resources, protection of natural spaces, protection of land, species. We're here for that, but we're not here for protecting those people. So if that's where you start, right? It's not a surprise that we are here where we are. But I will say there's one exception, and this needs to be lifted up. One of the founding issues upon which the modern environmental movement came together was the work of the United Farm Workers to ban the pesticide DDT. It's one of the most successful environmental campaigns that's ever been waged in the United States of America. And it was waged by the United Farm Workers, Cesar Chavez, and others, many, many, many others who are part of the leadership and the organizing of the United Farm Workers. And the environmental movement lifted that up. Cesar Chavez was at the first Earth Day celebration in Central Park in New York. And so they did recognize that there were some justice issues, but they focused on the elimination of this, you know, this damning chemical, DDT. And that was what they took from that United Farm Workers struggle. Not the struggle of the farm workers themselves, but that we could remove this pesticide from active use, which was doing so much ecological damage. And it was, and it continues to do ecological damage. DDT is not gone. We just don't sell it. We don't sell it in the United States. It's still manufactured and it's still used in other parts of the world. But it was the United Farm Workers that led that battle and that put that battle on Front Street. So we were there in spirit, but not in totality, right? And so everything that's happened in terms of the divergence between the environmental movement and the civil rights, racial justice movement could have been predicted at that onset in 1970. And the environmental justice movement has spent the last 35 years trying to knit those pieces back together. Not very successfully, sometimes more successfully than others, but here we are in this moment, and people cannot escape the reality of race and the primacy of racism in creating environmental and public health inequities.
And I just want to lift up a couple things you said. If people haven't seen the doll study, I really, please look it up. There are videos of little white and little Black children looking at dolls, and just watch it. And like Vernice just said, we cannot escape the impacts that race has on systemic inequities and of the public health outcomes that we're seeing. And so if you haven't seen the doll study, if you're not familiar with it, please do look it up. And I also, just to call out some of Dr. Robert Bullard's work from the early 90s, if you haven't revisited that work recently,
and
please
equally
do.
as important as Dr. Dorceta Taylor's
Thank
work,
you.
Dorceta at the University of Michigan, she's actually written, in my opinion, the book that looks at the parallel origins of the environmental and conservation movement and the environmental justice and civil rights movement, and how divergent they are and what those origins are. And it's kind of frightening. So if you really want to look at it, Dr. Dorceta Taylor has really written an extraordinary book that looks into that, going back to the 1600s. So it's really a fascinating story.
And I think that's critical to help people answer the question about Groundhog Day or a tipping point, to read the experiences of people, you know, from the 70s, from the early 90s, and before that. But I think people will be surprised when they read it and they could feel like they were reading something that was written today, written 2 weeks ago. And I think that really drives home the point, you know, really will make people think critically about what we can do differently now to make sure that it is a convergence of these concepts that are so important to link in order to see real change. And so I thank you for that very moving and I think thoughtful answer to help motivate people and maintain the pressure that we're putting on systems for change. And I think, and my next question is really about, you know, like you said, we're in the DC summer now. You know, we're also in the official start of hurricane season. And there have already been 3 named storms, which is the earliest that's ever happened. And we're also still very much in the midst of a pandemic. And so a lot of local health departments are rethinking what cooling centers look like right now, are rethinking what it means to shelter in place safely at this time. And we know that these storms, these extreme weather, these climate impacts have disproportionate impacts on low-income communities of color. And so what are your thoughts right now as we enter hurricane season, as we enter the summer, a high-risk season for climate impacts?
A couple of weeks ago, Rebecca, I learned a new word, syndemic, syndemic. And a syndemic is when 2 or more major crises are affecting and targeting a specific population. So before June 1st, I would have said racism and COVID, right? Now I will say racism, climate, and COVID, and the health disparities that, well, COVID to me is about race and health disparities. And we can pile on top of that. Dr. Adrian Hollis at the Union of Concerned Scientists has a blog out that really talks about the multiple dimensions of the syndemic, right? But we are always, let me speak for the group that I am a part of. As African Americans, we have always lived in that duality of oppressive forces. And, you know, depends on what year it is, what the forces are. So climate, you know, is an ever growing threat in terms of hurricane season. So my family, and I don't even think you know this, Rebecca, my father was Bahamian from the Bahamas, and my family lives in the Bahamas, almost all of them. Most of my family lives in the Bahamas. And so I usually go to see them every other summer. And I used to spend every summer of my life in the Bahamas with my family. My dad and I would go the Saturday after I got out of school, and we'd come back the Saturday before I started school, every single summer. So, and I think it has everything to do with why I became an environmentalist, is because of all the time I spent in the Bahamas with my family, but particularly swimming in crystal clear ocean water. That is the same ocean that abuts the United States on its eastern part. The Atlantic Ocean looks completely different in the Bahamas. It's clear. You can see down to the bottom of the ocean. And so that, I think that has a lot to do with having shaped my framework around why these issues are so important. So anyway, I was there last summer, took my aunt on my mother's side with me for her birthday, and had the time of my life, as I always do with my family. But it rained a lot while I was there, which really pissed me off, because they also have some of the most beautiful beaches in the world. And, you know, if you're going to go to the Caribbean, you got to come back with a tan, right? I mean, that's just sort of part of the thing. And it rained almost every day. And Evelyn and I were there for 10 days. That's my Aunt Evelyn. And sun came out sporadically, and then my cousin said to me, my cousin Sherry, who's just a few years younger than me, Sherry said, they're always watching the weather, right? They're always watching the Weather Channel, particularly during hurricane season. And she said, well, you know, there's the storm named Dorian that is, you know, coming off the East African coast. She said that, you know, maybe 5 days before I left to come back. I come home and then Dorian starts tearing up, right? And then 6 days after I get home, Dorian sweeps across the Bahamas and does utter wreckage and devastation. In fact, the National Weather Service said they are seriously considering changing the scale at which they measure hurricanes to create a Category 6, because what swept and hovered over the Bahamas was more than a Category 5 hurricane. It completely devastated an island in the Bahamas and completely covered over Grand Bahama with water. And people still survived. God only knows how they survived. A lot of people died, but it shook me to my core, Rebecca. It shook me to my core. Because if that storm had moved just a few degrees to the west, it would have come across Nassau. Nassau is the main population center in the Bahamas. 400,000 Bahamians live in Nassau. And my whole family would have been devastated. My cousin had, her only son was living on the island that was so devastated and impacted. And she didn't hear from him for 8 days. And so for 8 days, I'm calling her every day. We're calling her from all over the world. How is Devan? How is Devan? How is Devan? And she did not break. She did not lose hope. She did not cry. She did not say, oh my God, my only child. She just said, I will hear from him. And sure enough, on the 8th day, he marched with his family. His house was still standing. He lost his roof, but he marched with his family to the port, and he was able to get on a ship to get back to Nassau. And he was alive, but he said he had never experienced anything like it, and he must have walked by hundreds of dead bodies as he was getting from his house on foot with his family to the port so he could get a boat to Nassau. So I know intellectually, and I see it happening all over the world and happening in our country. I certainly am very connected to people in New Orleans and the Gulf Coast who lived through Katrina and Rita, and there have been many hurricanes since then. I know it intellectually, Rebecca, but when my family was on the bubble, it brought it home to me in a way like none of the research and the reports and the studies that I've seen, because they were completely vulnerable, and they are completely vulnerable. Every island state is completely vulnerable. The entire coast of the United States is vulnerable. People all over the world are vulnerable. It's 86 degrees in the Arctic Circle right now. At least it was yesterday. 86 degrees Fahrenheit in the Arctic freaking circle. Come on now, right? Yeah. Last year, it was so warm in Greenland that they lost over 1 billion cubic feet of ice that went into the Atlantic Ocean, right? So this is the real game. This hurricane season is the real game. This is also an El Niño weather pattern. So the National Weather Service has predicted that we're going to see more intense storms, hurricanes this season, and there'll probably be 3 to 4 that are going to make land in the United States. Well, almost anything that makes land in the United States is going to come through the Bahamas and Cuba and Haiti first, right? That's the longitudinal trajectory and the way it works. Those are 3 places that their citizens are extraordinary human beings who are incredibly resilient, but you could have all the resilience in the world and not be able to withstand what the Bahamas experienced last summer and what's going to happen again and again. So the issue of preparedness takes on a whole new dimension, right? The issue of building resilient structures, right? The issue of how people live and how people are safe and how you target resources to the most vulnerable as opposed to the wealthiest, right? Which is sort of how our resilience planning and emergency preparedness has gone. How you prepare. You know, one of the worst tragedies around Katrina is that they knew that storm was coming for days, and they did nothing nothing to stage and to prepare, right?
Yeah.
So we should have learned some collective things. The U.S. Network for Sustainable Development is doing some really great work around resilience hubs.
Yep.
I think that needs to be lifted up and put on blast. But how do you do that in the midst of a global pandemic? And a pandemic that, you know, now let's go to where your heart is and where I live, the state of Maryland. What the hell, right? What the hell? So everybody wants to give our governor all this credit for, you know, he put in orders, people have to stay at home. And then the business community rose up and said, look, we're losing all this money. And you know who was clamoring the loudest? Ocean City, Maryland, right?
Mm-hmm.
We got to open up. So he lifted things and people opened up. 3 places did not open up. Baltimore City,
Yep.
Montgomery County, and Prince George's County, where I live, which is the epicenter of the COVID pandemic in the state of Maryland. I still can't wrap my head around that.
Yep.
Every day, Rebecca, every day in my city, in Bowie, Maryland, we get an emergency text message every single day from the city of Bowie that tells us how many new cases there are in Bowie, how many new cases there are in Maryland, how many new cases there are in Prince George's County. Yesterday, we had 117 new cases. Now, it's down from the high numbers in May, but it's going up again, right? I don't know when I'm going to leave my house. I swear I would love to get past my mailbox. I really would. I haven't done that in weeks and weeks.
But
and
we
weeks,
don't know that it's safe yet. And
it's not safe. We're in round 2. Some places are experiencing a resurgence. Yep. We're still in round 1. Yep. And here comes round 2. It's going to be devastating. So what does that mean for the people out in the streets, right?
Absolutely. And I think I so appreciate your framing of syndemic, because I think for folks in the health field in particular, the idea of social determinants of health, the idea that in this country, your zip code has a greater impact than your genetic code on not just your life expectancy, but your quality of life.
So let's just drill on that point for a moment. So this is why, for those of you who are listening who know nothing about where Rebecca and I live in the DMV, Prince George's County, Maryland is the most affluent majority African-American county and population in the United States of America. And the city that I live in is the economic driver of our county. It's not the wealthiest county in Maryland, but it is among the wealthiest counties in Maryland. And it has the highest per capita income among African-Americans. And it's kind of off the charts. I mean, this is not I'm not talking small money. These are people making major money, living in mega houses, right? That ate up all the farmland that used to be here in our county. That's a whole nother topic.
We have several ideas for other webcasts already.
But the fact that the COVID epicenter in the state of Maryland would be here in Prince George's County defies everything we think we know about pandemics, about poverty, and lack of health access, although we could use more hospitals and we could use more health infrastructure, but we're doing okay. We could do a lot better, but we're doing okay. We're better than certainly our counties in Western and the Eastern Shore of Maryland that have much less health infrastructure than we do. We're a suburb of Washington, D.C., so there's all that health infrastructure, and Baltimore City, and there's all that health infrastructure. We're right in the middle. So it's not for lack of infrastructure.
That's right.
It's not for lack of education. Right? Everybody here has got a college degree. Everybody got a college degree, and many people got PhDs. So it's not that, right? It's not closeness of how we live, like New York City, which is where I'm from. It's not dense population in small geographic area. It's not that, right? So what the hell is it? What is it? And if it ain't race, somebody tell me what it is, right? So back to our original point of the conversation, the nexus between environment and race, public health, environment and race, climate change, health, equity, and race, right, is endemic. It's here with us all the time. And here we are in a moment of crises that we've actually never been in before as a country. At least none of us who are alive have ever been in this moment before, not since the Spanish flu in 1918. Which was not about Spain. I should just say that. It was not about Spain. They just were reporting out their numbers, right? They were not the source of the flu. This is like nothing we've ever seen. And what's happening to Black and Brown and Indigenous people who are dying disproportionately from COVID is a story that was a flash in the pan for a minute. For a minute, we had the clamor to get disaggregated data out of the CDC to tell us what is happening to people of color in the midst of this pandemic. Yep. And it took them the longest time to release that data. And then they started to release the data. And even today, when people see that data, they're only reporting out from 58% of the population in the United States. So we still don't know the totality of this disparity, right? But we know this. We know that Black people are getting COVID and are dying disproportionately from it. We know that Indigenous people have the highest per capita rate of death from COVID of any population, including New York City, which was thought to be ground zero. No, ground zero is actually the Navajo Nation and the Navajo Nation in Arizona, New Mexico, New Mexico, Nevada, I think. No. Anyway, 3 states, right? And the Lakota Sioux Nation in South Dakota are the per capita epicenters of the COVID epidemic. Latino communities are on the bubble, right? Because so many Latinos are frontline workers. Farm workers are still out there, picking the food that we all eat so that we can be at home and order from Instacart and from Whole Foods.
And people are doing our shopping for it.
And let me just point the finger at myself, because Lord knows Vernice has been ordering up a storm from those places. But there's food on those shelves. None of us who can afford it have had to go hungry, because other people have been out there on the front lines making sure that we continue to have a food supply. We've sent Latino workers and other people of color back into the worst conditions in these meat packing plants to make sure that we have enough freaking hamburger, right?
Yep.
And the chicken plants on the eastern shore of Virginia and Maryland, right? People are risking their lives to uplift this quote unquote quality of life, but they are not safe, right? So when they're working double or triple shift at these plants, and there's a curfew in the places where they live, that makes them vulnerable to police harassment and police and just over policing, right? We don't want to call out. They need to shut these places down.
And these are exactly the kind of situations we find ourselves in that perpetuate the systemic racism
absolutely
that is baked in to what we're doing. And I think one of the things I've been most disappointed about is when media coverage of these health disparities is talking about it as if, first of all, as if they're just learning about, as if they didn't know, and then second, as if it exists, these health disparities among populations of color exist because they're populations of color, instead of actually at least alluding to the fact that it's been,
or the governor of North, or some elected official in North Dakota said, there's no problem in North Dakota. It's just those people
that's right
in those meatpacking plants. And in other words, they're the source of the disease. And if you just corral them someplace, then the rest of us will be okay.
In Louisiana, they were talking, they just said, well, Black people have higher rates of kidney disease.
Oh, well,
that's why.
If we're going to go here, we have to lift up my favorite affront or my least favorite affront, which is a statement made by the chief doctor, the Surgeon General of the United States, who until this Corona task force, who knew the Surgeon General of the United States was Black? What basement are they keeping him in at CDC?
He's a graduate of UMBC.
Is he really? Well, he had the lowest profile of any Surgeon General in the history of Surgeon Generals until they put him out there at those cockamamie White House, coronavirus press conferences to say that Black people have a lot of pre-existing health conditions because of their lifestyles. And I'm telling you, Rebecca, if I could have jumped through that television, I would have gone straight for his throat. How can you utter such ignorance as a Black person, as the Surgeon General? How can you say such a thing?
I thought as a field of public health, we were well well past that. And so we have a lot of work still to do. Now, look, Vernice, I think at this point in the webcast, people will realize that you and I have been friends for a long time, and we could probably talk about this
yes. Let's take
for a very long time.
Where would you like to end this conversation?
So I think I'll wrap us up with my final question, which is, in, you know, knowing that you know, I work with a number of health professionals, work in the health field, and what is your advice? And let's make it succinct.
Sure.
You know, specific things that health professionals can do, who health professionals who are trying to address health disparities through climate action. What is your advice for health professionals?
So I want to suggest that folks get very clear on climate communications and the nexus between climate communications and culturally relevant communications, right? So this is a point in time when people are getting bombarded with a lot of different messages, and many of those messages are conflicting messages. It's okay to go out. It's okay to do what you normally do. Don't wear a mask. I'm not wearing a mask. You don't need to wear a mask. People are getting a lot of disinformation. So it's really important that we continue to drive a singular message about how difficult this moment is, the precautions that people have to take. The emergency is not over. Certain populations are more vulnerable and therefore need to practice more safety measures, that we need to do everything we can to keep each other safe. And at a minimum, we must wear a mask whenever we are in proximity to other people. So you see a lot of people out at the demonstrations are wearing masks. Almost everybody is wearing a mask. We'll see what happens when they go to Oklahoma next week in Juneteenth and have this MAGA demonstration, right? Don't allow people to get sucked into the battle around disinformation. Keep your communications clear, keep them sharp, keep them targeted, keep them pithy, keep them informative, but keep the communications going and make sure that you're drilling into in all the ways that you might not normally do communications. Go on Black and Latino radio, right? Go on public access television. Run PSAs on programs that people of color watch. Provide support to indigenous communities who are battling almost single-handedly, battling a phenomena and a pandemic that threatens to render truly invisible and genocide in indigenous populations. Give them all the support you can. Provide resources to the movement to support Black Lives and Black Lives Matter. Donate to folks, volunteer your time. If you can't be out there, my colleagues have told me, I was telling Rebecca this before we started recording, my colleagues who are much younger than I am have said to me definitively, Vernice, you're in that age group that you might be, you know, particularly susceptible. So we need you to stay in lockdown. We're going to go out there in the street, but we need you to stay in lockdown. Why? Because when this is over, and it will be over at some point, and when we rise back up to do the work that we do at Metropolitan Group and all the social justice work that we do, we need you to be in full form and full gear to help lead that battle, right? And at first I laughed at it and I was like, oh, so you're calling me old? And they said, no, we're calling you leader, right? And the leader has to be safe. I cannot tell you how much that means to me. And they keep calling and texting, can we bring you anything? Can we go grocery shop for us? Like, I'm not dead. I'm not that old. Really, I'm not. But the point is that if they say stay home, Prince George's County, Maryland, I'm talking to you. Stay home, right? The young people may have some more resilience, but you got to be as cautious as you can. I think you have made this statement about the power of Black lives, and that Black lives do matter. Your lives matter. So if we could just more socially distance while we're out there in the streets, that would be great, because this is not going to end in June or July of 2020. This is a battle for the ages, and we all gotta be as healthy as we can be. We gotta lift each other up. I think it's also a time to remember what it's like to have mutual aid, right? To help your neighbors, to look out for each other, to get resources to people who don't have it, people who are losing their jobs, young people who have lost their jobs or can't get in the job market, but yet are burdened with student debt, right? There's so many ways that people need our help. And if you have it, help give it to somebody else.
Vernice, thank you so much. And we do have, at ecoAmerica, we have a Let's Talk Health and Climate guide, and it exactly says we stay above the fray. That's what and make sure your messages are getting through. And so I so appreciate ending on a note of really focusing on climate communications, and making sure that those messages permeate, where they need to be heard, where you can be the most impactful. And so I truly appreciate our whole conversation today.
Rebecca, let me share this last phrase.
Yes,
I saw
please.
this on Twitter yesterday. Masking for a friend.
Mm.
I'm asking for a friend.
So again, thank you so much for spending time with me today to share your wisdom and concrete actions. Let's all follow through on Vernice's advice, take action, and build back better. Please join us every Thursday for our regularly scheduled Let's Talk Climate webcasts. Engage with us online using the hashtag Let's Talk Climate, and be sure to subscribe and follow us on our social channels for the latest thought leadership, resources, and episodes on climate action and advocacy. From all of us at ecoAmerica and Climate for Health, thank you. Please join me in caring for our climate in order to care for our health. Stay well, stay safe, get active.